Coming up on More Than Before.
Values are who we are, even when nobody else is looking. And if we don't have values, how do we value ourselves? How do we value other people? And how do we treat other people the way we would want to be treated? Going back to the golden rule.
This is More Than Before with Nathan Cook.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I have the great honor and distinction to talk with my good friend today. He is a highly accomplished martial arts practitioner of over 50 years. He doesn't look 50 years, by the way. He has black belts in 5 different martial arts systems. He is a 5-time inductee into the Martial Arts Hall of Fame. He has a doctorate in theology, 2 best-selling books. I could keep on going on and on of how amazing this guy is on paper, but I think what's really amazing is who he is in everyday life. He's a family guy. He's got 6 amazing children doing some amazing things in the world. He's a man of faith. He is the black belt leader, but most importantly, he is a good friend of mine. John Terry, welcome to the show, my friend. How are you doing today?
Nathan, I am doing fantastic, and it is so exciting to be face-to-face having conversation with you and enjoying to get spend a few minutes with you today.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because when you first meet someone, you're kind of feeling them out. You're kind of wondering who they are, and you come off very unassuming. You know, he could just kill you with your pinky finger. You just don't even know it. But that's what I love about you. You have this really warm demeanor about you. You have a huge heart. What are you working on? What do you find yourself doing with most of your time today?
You know, most of what I'm doing today right now, Nathan, is I just finished a 12-city tour. My 8th book, The Black Belt Secrets of Success, released April 1st of 2024. I had an opportunity to go coast to coast 4 times over 8 weeks, appearing at some different conferences and sharing really the secrets of success. Keynote I've been doing is called Climbing Your Mount Everest of Success. And I kind of recount a story when I had an opportunity several years ago to meet Sir Edmund Hillary Jr. And he was retracing his dad's steps up Mount Everest and shared some incredible stories of that climb. And so I took excerpts of that and kind of weaved that into an interesting story of how we all have to find our way to the top of success. And it's different for every one of us.
Yeah, 100%. And I love that success is always different from person to person.
That's right.
If it was the same for everyone, it would be a little bit too easy for people to get up the mountain of success. I love your story. Like there are so many different aspects and components of your story. I want to go way back to the very beginning. So if I'm not mistaken, you actually were born in Heidelberg, Germany, and then you actually grew up in Arkansas, right?
Grew up in Fort Smith, Arkansas until I was about 13 years old.
Yeah.
And then relocated from a big city to a small town. And that's really where my story started. I was a big city nobody. Dad said, I've got this new opportunity to buy into a furniture store. We're going to go to Russellville, Arkansas, little small town, little small community, and you're going to be a somebody. Well, I became a somebody. I became the target of every bully in school. And that's how I got started in the martial arts.
Ah, it's crazy. So, so out of your family, where were you in the family dynamics?
2 of us. I'm the oldest, and I have a sister that's 3 years younger than I am.
Well, and so you had quite a few strikes against you then. So you were the firstborn. You were kind of a military brat, just for a very short period of time.
And a preacher's kid. Yeah, I had 3 strikes against me right out of the chute.
Which is, I don't know. It's kind of funny because when you meet people from different aspects of life and you hear like these small little intro pieces of the first child or the military brat or the PK preacher's kid, I do find that there are some truths to the rumors about children, but I don't know. What kind of child were you up until the age of 13? Like, who were you as a child? Were you outgoing, rambunctious? Were you to yourself? I kind of have a feeling that you were probably more reserved than maybe what you are today.
Oh, Nathan, you know me better than that. You know, it's funny when I go back and watch the 8mm films that Dad had a camera everywhere we went. And when I watch the films, my parents described me as the ADD poster child. I was the guy that couldn't sit still, always bouncing off the walls, always wanting attention, always doing something. My imagination was constantly running. Grew up in the era watching Roy Rogers and, Cowboys and Indians. And so my bicycle was my horse, and I would ride it all over the neighborhood trying to rescue the damsels in distress or find the Indians that had kidnapped and stolen the gold or whatever. And I was constantly doing something, just creative, energetic, and just fun-loving kid that was the kid that couldn't sit still.
So what did you find yourself like? What were things that you were prior to martial arts? Because martial arts, I think, is a huge component of your life. In those earlier years up until till the age of 13, what were you trying to find your identity in? What were you kind of wrestling around with? Because I know you're heavily involved. Your dad was heavily involved with the church, being a pastor. But what were some of the things that you found yourself being drawn to as a younger kid?
It's interesting. I fell in love early on with reading and writing.
Mm.
And I started writing, get this, in elementary school, I started doing television with my dad. We had a local television stations, and dad was in the clothing business for years. And he's in this little store called Poise-N-Ivy. So think Men's Warehouse back in the 1960s, all right? And so they had, because back that day, the Mod Squad, if you go on Pluto, you can still see that on television. The Mod Squad was a group of detectives, and it was kind of an uncouth group. You had Lawrence Fishburne. It was one of his first roles in it. He was part of the Mod Squad. And so they had the Ivy Squad that would do these TV commercials promoting their clothing. And they got these children's line of clothing in. So dad drugged me into the commercial business when I was doing commercials in the 4th grade, and fell in love with television, fell in love with acting. And so I got this crazy idea. I'm going to start writing movies. So I started writing scripts. They were detective scripts. And I had a teacher that just loved me. And she let me perform with the cast and crew these little vignettes, little short 3-act plays on the stage in the cafeteria for the entire elementary school. And I did that in the 4th grade and in the 5th grade and in the 6th grade. And I think we put on 4 or 5 different basic storyline, good guy, bad guy, bad guy gets it at the end. The good guy always wins. But we did those, and it was just so much fun because the kids got a chance to act and we got a chance to have fun. And the teacher just continued to encourage us. And it was my first introduction to really being on a stage outside of in front of a television where you're staring into a lens. I was in front of people and found out I loved it. And from that, just began to continue to write short stories, long stories, and then got into writing books and still writing every single week, still writing something.
It's cool to see kind of the early on pieces that we don't like when you're in life in the moment, you don't really see it until later on when you look back, right? We always say
That's
hindsight,
right. Yeah.
but it really is cool to see people's stories and how they play out throughout their entire life. Up until the age of 13, what was the original cause for you guys to move at the age of 13?
Well, Dad had been in the clothing business for years, and he had some friends that Dad had mentored and trained that had learned to sell clothing. And he had relocated to Russellville and got involved in the furniture business. And they were looking to put in a new business endeavor and looking for a partner in that business. And so Pete, my neighbor and friend that Dad knew for years, reached out and said, hey, we've got this opportunity. If you'd like to invest in this business and come in and be a partner, we're going to open a furniture store. Well, Dad knew nothing about furniture, but he loved to sell. And it was an opportunity to be a business owner. And he said, yeah, I'll do that. So we loaded up the U-Haul and went from Fort Smith to Russellville, Arkansas. That's what got me there.
Early on, you had alluded to this not really alluded. You just went straight out and, the bullying from early on, which, if you, back in your day, a boy wanting to express himself, doing plays, doing things that are in front of other people, maybe having a little bit of ADD all over the place, it kind of gets you in trouble. I could see that. From my understanding, you were picked on quite a bit as a kid, and then the move was supposed to actually help you to improve life, right? But when you got there, things weren't exactly as good as you had hoped.
That's exactly right. I wanted to play sports, and I loved football. But, look at me. I'm a small guy. Now, back then, I was 75 pounds soaking wet, 5'4", 5'5". Not a lot of action and opportunity for a little tiny kid. But the hope was when I went from being in this big city with this large football team that, my 7th grade year, I played 1 down. And I got to play actually 1 set of downs. I got to play 4 downs. And I trained as a cornerback. And they put me in as a linebacker for 4 downs. And that was my entire 7th grade football career. Got the daylights knocked out of me 4 times in a row. And I'm thinking, what am I doing? So, we moved to this town thinking it's going to be great. And it was good. I mean, I got a chance to play sports and got a chance to, see some success in track and a little bit of success in football. But when I first got there, I was the new kid. I was the little scrawny kid. And I was that little ADHD kid that probably just irritated everybody. And as a result of that, I got picked on a lot. And so Dad's idea was, I thought, go to the principal, get the principal to stop. No, he enrolls me in a martial arts class. I'm the only kid in the class.
And he didn't just enroll you in a martial. He, from my understanding, he drove you down, he dropped you off, and then he left you.
And he left me. Exactly. Yeah. He had just sold, it was funny. He had just sold, the guy that ran the studio, he had just sold him some furniture and was telling him my story. And, Master Wetzel was still a good friend. And he said, I don't normally take kids, but in your case, yeah, let him come down and we'll see what we can do. So I show up. And I'm looking at all these guys, and they're 6'2", 6'3", most of them either military or law enforcement. And here's this little tiny kid. They could snap me with a twig, like a twig. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what has my dad done? He stuck me in here and I'm going to get killed. But I said, at least I'm going to look cool in these white pajamas I was wearing.
And they are comfortable. I will say, if you've never worn a gi, like a really nice gi, brushed cotton, ooh, baby, those you could just wear those all day. We have.
Yeah. But it was old school martial arts. It was Goju-Ryu, so it was very old school. No mats. It was concrete floor, traditional makiwara. The kicking bag in the corner was made out of an old potato sack, one of those old, rough-hewn things. And it was stuffed full of blue jeans and had a couple of weights in the bottom of it. I mean, it was an old school martial arts studio, and that's where I got my start.
Wow, that's so cool. And for those of you listening that aren't, like, if you're not in the martial arts world, like it's very interesting to see how it has changed and how things have also not changed. There are a lot of fundamental traditional pieces about martial arts that are really cool. Based off of, when you started going, people have to understand, like, women were not allowed in the martial arts school and children were not allowed in the martial arts school. And if you were able to get in the martial arts school, it was not air conditioned. No. It was not, oh, you hurt my back. It was, no, you get up and you don't whine, you don't cry. Like there was an old Goju-Ryu sensei. I remember that he did a seminar and it was just with our school. And he had driven all the way down from a pretty far location. And we're sitting there, we're in horse stance and we're doing punches. And he walks up to my good friend Michael and he rubs the front of his fist and he goes, oh, soft. And for those of you who aren't martial artists, that's not a compliment. He made us get down on our stomachs, and we did knuckle push-ups for like 20 minutes because his hands were too soft. And so you have to understand, this is like a crucible moment in your life. And there was one small little piece of hope in this, right? There was a cute little 24-year-old girl.
Well, initially I thought it was a piece of hope. When I got in, the instructor said, I'm glad you're here. He said, we've had this new student join and this beautiful 24-year-old is in the corner about my size. And I thought, well, that's not bad. What I didn't know is she'd come out of a bad relationship and was there to learn self-defense. So it ends up my dad's paying good money for me to get beat up by a girl 3 nights a week. And she beat the daylights out of me every time I was there. And the instructor was like, if you don't go home with something bruised or, you're not a little bit sore, you didn't have class. I mean, that was just old school martial arts.
Yeah.
And so I complained to Dad, and it was funny. Dad said, well, son, when you learn to fight like a girl, the bullying will stop. And he was right. I finally learned to fight like a girl, and the bullying at school stopped.
I feel like your father has had a pretty major impact on your life. Your father was, and I think still is, one of the few pastors and preachers that I've ever heard that is that not only preaches from the pulpit but also worked a job at the same time. Yeah. It's very uncommon nowadays. Usually it's a full-time job, a full-time gig. Your father was an entrepreneur. You're an entrepreneur. What do you remember early on about some of those early lessons that you got to glean from your father?
Dad was very diligent in what he did because he was running a business and then later owning a business and then also pastoring. Dad had to manage his time very well. And one of the things I learned early on from my dad was the value of budgeting time and creating time blocks so that you could get more things done in less time. And that was something I picked up on early on that has followed me through now for, I'm 29 for the 34th year in a row. So I've been, for the last 34 years of being 29, I'm still learning to do time management and hoping one day I can manage it so I never turn 30. But that was something I learned early on. Probably for the second thing I learned from my dad, Nathan, was the value of reading. Dad was a prolific reader. And as you can see behind me, I've got this huge library that I've amassed over the years. But it started with my dad. He bought me 2 books when I was 13, Developing the Leader Within You by a guy we know. And he bought me Think and Grow Rich.
Mm.
And I remember Dad said, if you read these books and write me a book report, I'll give you $5 a book. And I thought, that's $10. I can go do something with that. I had a lot of money back then. But I did, and it started me on a love affair with books that continues to this day. And every day, as part of my ritual and my routine, I spend 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes more, reading something either inspirational, educational, vocational, or I'm reading and studying either history and what I can learn from it, or a biography of someone through their successes and failures. I can glean insights that are beneficial. Two big things that stand out with my dad.
You know, if my dad had offered me $5 for every book I had read, I would probably still be poor. No, I was not a reader. I was not a learner. Were you pretty a voracious learner in school then?
Growing up, I had a photographic memory. Now, it's not as good as it used to be, but I excelled in school. I was in accelerated classes starting in elementary school. So I was essentially a grade and a half ahead because once I saw something once or twice, I could immediately recall it. And so going through school, it was never really a challenge for me because if I could read the content once or twice, I had it in my head. When I was in college to go take an exam, they'd set us in these big pits and they'd give us this exam and I would stop and I'd look up and I would do this and I would go down and I would just go across and then I'd write the answer. I actually got pulled out a time or two from taking exams. People asked me what I'm doing. I said, I'm reading what I wrote. And, they're checking my arms and I'm like, no, it's, I have a photographic memory and I can remember those things. And that was something unique that was beneficial, but it constantly challenged me as I'm putting things in my head. What else can I put there?
You graduate from high school. What happens after high school then?
So high school, I go off to college because mom and dad said, you got to go to college and get a degree. Hated it. Went for 2 years, absolutely hated it. I said, stupid waste of time. So I went into the business world and I went to work for an electrical wholesale shop. Started out sweeping and doing inventory in the back. And within 2 years, I'd worked my way up to assistant manager in the store. I'd done every position there was, and I was in position to go into management. Had a company by the name of Prudential reach out and said, hey, we think you're fantastic at what you're doing. We'd love to have you come to work in the financial services arena. Something I'd always dreamed of doing. My uncle was a CPA. My grandfather was a banker. So money was something that intrigued me, and understanding how money works and how to make it work for you was intriguing. So I decided to pursue that. Well, I went into the world of Prudential and found out that everything with them was extremely regimented and you had to follow this very specific process and you couldn't deviate. And that wasn't me. I wanted to be able to go here or go there based upon how the client wanted to be sold to. And I didn't want to follow a basic script and do these things they demanded. So that world for me lasted about 6 months. Got a great education, learned a lot of the basics of insurance and investing and money management and things of that nature, but I couldn't fit in that little corporate box of having to sell specific products a specific way. So I went into the independent space, became very successful as a financial advisor early on. Individuals started saying, can you teach me to do what you do? Well, the next thing I know, I'm coaching and training in doing sales and marketing and began to do more and more and more of that. And that was first phase of getting into the coaching industry, was doing that some 30 years ago, teaching other sales professionals how to sell. And then other people outside the financial services arena says, can you teach me to do what in my world, what you do in this world? And so that just began to open up some other opportunities as well.
You're working hard. You're a really hard worker. Anyone that knows you knows that, like, you put your nose to the grind and you're going to get it done. And I would imagine that at a certain point in your life, maybe that was harder on your family than for you. How did that kind of drive to want to be good at something, how did that affect personal life?
The drive for me is there's always something more to do. And that's kind of the driving force for me on the inside. And I remember having spent some time in the financial services industry, went back to college and decided I wanted to get a degree. So I went back and got a degree in business management and business marketing. Well, while I'm there, I saw this opportunity to start a commercial sound company. So I go out and buy a bunch of equipment, and every weekend I'm traveling all over the state doing sound, hiring kids at college and giving them a job. So entrepreneurship has been a big thing for me. But my parents were very encouraging that if there's something you need to do, they said two things: figure out how to do it, so you're not just out there just winging it. But if you're going to do it, you have to do it well. And they were very focused on doing things exceptionally. And so I became very driven. Now, from that, you've got to be careful when you're very driven, because you can push yourself to the point, and I did early on in my mid-20s. I had pushed myself physically to the point I started having some heart issues. I started having some inflammation around the heart from just, putting in 15 to 18-hour days every day all the time, and physically had to step back. Even though I thought I was in great shape, I was exercising and doing all the things I needed to do, I had to stop for a season and begin to realize, even though you're driven, there still has to be work-life balance, because if there's not, and all you do is work and there's no life, at some point you're either going to burn out, or you're going to burn up, or you're going to blow up. And that was a realization to me early on, that as driven as I am, there's a bit in a horse's mouth for a reason, because if you just let the horse go, the horse is going to run till it drops dead. And so I had to learn to put the bit in my mouth and occasionally pull back, or give other people the privilege and the opportunity to speak into my life to pull back, so I don't just go full bore and burn up, blow up, or die. Yeah.
I think it's really fascinating to talk to. Out of curiosity, when did you start teaching within martial arts? How old were you?
I started teaching self-defense classes in college. And that was something I thought was important. Having a sister growing up and seeing, guys that I didn't want to mess with her, taught her a few things. She asked me to teach her friends. And so self-defense became an important part of my life. And I've really been teaching self-defense classes probably since I'd say my sophomore year of college. And I've done that on and off my entire life. My daughter, Jessie, now teaches self-defense classes. But my first teaching of martial arts was probably early 30s when I got involved in teaching and learning Shorin-Ryu and training in a different system, and had a chance, with the instructor's blessing, to start working with the kids and the youth in the youth program they were developing. And I had a chance to be an assistant instructor there.
Wow. It's the reason I ask is I find there's kind of a shift. At least it was a shift in my world when I went from being the student to being the teacher. With power comes responsibility. We've heard that, right? But
right.
Until you have power over a class, you don't realize how quickly it can go to your head.
Things can go bad really quick.
Things go really bad really quick. I just remember very specifically, I think I might have been maybe a purple belt or something like that. And my teacher said, "Okay, Nathan, I'm going to go out of the class for a moment, and you're going to lead the group in Sensei Says," which is essentially Simon Says, but,
right.
Sensei. And I don't know what happened, but let's just say power got to my head, and I had the entire class jumping on one foot and, squawking like a chicken. I'll never forget being disciplined, being put in the corner of the room. I don't know, I probably had push-ups or something like that. And then I sat for the rest of the class, to the end of the class. And it was a very vivid moment for me of remembering, man, there's something to this power thing that you can't let it go to your head. I'm curious for you, early on in your martial arts career, what was your relationship with this idea of power? And has that shifted in terms of how you view power today?
Oh, absolutely. If I think back to my very first episodes of teaching, it was, look at me, I'm the teacher. And I learned early on because oftentimes my dad would come down and watch the classes, and Dad would give me some critique and feedback. And being a pastor's kid, you got it whether you wanted it or not. And one of the things Dad reminded me early on is, he said, "Son, when you get up there to teach, it's not about you, it's about them." And realizing that my responsibility was to help them learn and grow. And if I was making it all about me and not about them, that became a problem for me, because I wasn't being an effective teacher. But it was very easy. I mean, the ADD kid that wants to get the attention, when you get put in that position of authority, it's very easy to say, "Look at me, here I am, here's what I can do." And then it becomes all about me rather than about the people I've been tasked to teach. And realizing I'm responsible for the outcome that they demonstrate when the real instructor comes back in the room, the senior instructor, and says, "Okay, show me what you were taught." And you've probably been there on the receiving end of that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I think another really interesting aspect of your life too is the fact that for 3 years you were a single parent. You've been married for 30 years now to your beautiful bride.
Yep.
And there was a period where you were a single parent, and, just recently my wife had some medical stuff that came up, and I was taking care of our kids and really juggling a lot of stuff. And I had this moment of thinking about, man, life would be incredibly difficult and almost feel insurmountable if it was just me raising my kids, my three kids right now. And I'm curious, during that period of your life where, you're working, you're trying to take care of your kids, you're trying to father them and teach them. And I'm curious, what were some of those lessons during that crucible time in your life of being a single parent?
Nathan, that was a difficult time in my life, in trying to provide for my kids. And in providing for my kids, I had to travel in my work. Well, you can't travel when you got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old if you've got nobody to watch them.
Yeah.
And, my oldest one had some separation anxiety because of the divorce that I'd gone through. And if I was gone for any period of time, it stressed him. And so I ended up having to reshape how I did a lot of my business during that time. But I made it my focus that if I do nothing else, my primary responsibility is to be the very best dad that I can, to raise them and help them get through this difficult time we were all getting through together, and to equip and prepare them for what life has for them. God put them on this earth on purpose for a purpose. My responsibility as their dad was to help them discover that and to develop that so they could step into the full potential of who they are. And so everything else in my world took a back seat. I was willing to make less money. I was willing to not travel as much. I was willing to not do the business related things because family came first. Making sure that family unit was secure. We had a roof over our head. We had food to eat. And we had fun in building and developing relationship together. That to me was the most important. And looking back at that, seeing the things I did with my kids and now looking at those two young men and the men they've grown up to be, I'm like, man, that was hard. But if I had to go back and do it, I would have done it exactly the same way.
Well, and it's funny, I think we discount the hard times because those hard times truly do allow us to grow.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, especially if you allow them to. I remember going back to the martial arts stuff. I remember coming back from a tournament at one point, and I had my clock cleaned. I was wiped the floor with, and I remember coming back, and my sensei. I remember driving back. It was like a 7-8 hour drive back to the school, and I remember one of the things that we'd always do is he would always say, "What did you learn, and what did you take away?" Always hated that question, especially after you get your clock cleaned. You didn't do well. There was a point where things started to shift for me. I was probably around the age of 13, 14, when I started to realize that the most beneficial times of my life were the hardest times where I failed. Right? We always want to be seen in the successful light, but it's really in the failure. It's really in the day-to-day grind that we see results, that we actually can make an impact. How have you been able to make an impact that you have had so far in life? Because you have had some of the most amazing credentials and so many amazing accolades. What are some of the things that you've done in the dark, that you've done in the background that no one else has really seen, that have allowed you to really see the success that you've seen in your life?
Nathan, I'll borrow a phrase from our good friend, Dr. John Maxwell, where he says, the secret to your success is found in your daily routine. And it's in the dark that you're doing the things of preparation that get you ready. And I look back over, where I am now, and Dad and I were just having this conversation the other day. My dad's 88, and I was having lunch with him and bought him his favorite Supreme pizza from his favorite brick oven pizza place. And while we were there, we sat down and he looked across the table and he said, John, did you ever think when you were a 13-year-old little boy, scared to death to go to school, and I enrolled you in martial arts in that old beat up, dirty, hard school that I put you in? He said, did you ever imagine that you would be where you are now? And I stopped and I thought for a minute and I said, yes and no, Dad. I said, I knew I wanted to do something in martial arts and I knew that was important, but I said, I never saw myself being on the stage that I am now, having the privilege to lead the United States Martial Arts Hall of Fame, having the privilege to travel and teach all over the world, now being known as the black belt leader. But as we begin to talk about that process, the question you just brought up takes me back to that conversation. Dad said, did you think about all the times you were up late at night reading, or you were going to a conference, or I took you to a conference, or we were listening to Earl Nightingale, or we were listening to this person on tape or this person on a record, and you were taking notes and I was asking you questions. And he said, did you think about all those times that you were getting all this stuff inside of you that it was preparing you for something bigger than you ever imagined. And I said, no, I didn't. But it was in all of those times of that learning and growing, getting into that uncomfortable place, going through failure and discovering what doesn't work so you can try to figure out what does. It was through all of that, looking back, that I'm saying I learned a lot. And there was a lot of investment and time I put into myself and still do every day. But because of that, I'm able to be where I am today because I started paying the price a long time ago to get where I want to be today.
What was the jump? I mean, I would imagine that because of the extensive amount of time you've spent in the martial arts world, when did you start teaching more as an occupation and less of a hobby? When did that shift?
That actually was forced upon me. And that's another interesting story. The instructor that I was training with, one of my best friends and I were training together, and we'd become good friends in the school. And our instructor got arrested in a police sting and showed up on statewide television. And it was one of those situations that it was a very awkward moment for him, but none of the parents wanted their children around this individual because of what he had done. And so they came to us and said, we want you and Kyle, my friend, later my business partner, we want you to keep teaching our kids. Well, we weren't black belts at the time. He was a purple belt. I was a blue belt. And I said, well, we're not black belts. And their response was, we don't care. You're teaching our children. You care about our children. You love our children. You want the best for our children. Who else do we want teaching our children?
Wow.
So I picked up the phone and I called another couple of instructors that were part of our testing panel, told them what had happened. And I said, we've got all these parents wanting us to teach them. And I remember Cal Rooks, one of the instructors, good friend, he said, John, teach them. And I said, teach them? He said, open a school and teach them. And he hung up the phone. And I didn't know what we were going to do. So here's what we did, Nathan. I was running a broker dealer in Russellville, Arkansas. And I had built this broker dealer for some friends of mine, and they had asked me to run it until they got it up and running and they could relocate it. So I was kind of an interim director for them in this organization. And so I had about 4 or 5 kids that wanted to train in martial arts. So every night, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday nights, we would go into the lobby of my broker dealer office. We'd move all the furniture out. We got a mat, an old, nasty, horrible, stinking, smelly mat that we got from a friend of mine that his wife had a gymnastics studio. And we rolled that out in the middle of our lobby. And we had these 5 kids in there bouncing off the paneling walls and learning and training in the martial arts. And then other parents found out what we were doing, and they start showing up at my broker dealer, not to do investing, but wanting to enroll their kids in martial arts. So we opened a school around the corner, and it's like 40 feet long and 10 feet wide. So it was this little narrow, skinny space. And we went from that to a 2,000 square foot building to a 4,000 square foot building. And then when I sold the school to Kyle and stepped away from it, he's now in an 8,000 square foot building and still continuing to run the school and doing extremely well. So we built it right. We did it right because we focused on not just teaching martial arts, but teaching all the important leadership and character and values that are part of this martial arts code of conduct. And our goal, and that became part of the premise of my signature book, Black Belt Leadership 101, was to teach these kids not just to be good martial artists, but what it meant to become a black belt leader in life, where they could make good choices and lead themselves well. And if we could do that, we were truly instilling something in kids that nobody else in the community was doing. And it was teaching them to become the very best version of themselves inside the dojo and outside the dojo. And that resonated. And to this day, it still does.
I feel like that is a pretty common thing that we find nowadays, that kids aren't learning core values. They're not learning leadership principles like they used to in sports.
They're not.
Like, I mean, it's fascinating to me to kind of look at this, because when I was growing up, that was the reason you were in sports. Yeah, to win, you wanted to be good at it. It wasn't necessarily that you knew you were going to go play in the NFL or anything like that, but there was character development in that. Your parents didn't let you quit. When I wanted to quit martial arts, my mom said, we already paid for the semester, you're going back. And she didn't let me quit. And I find it really fascinating that there are so few places to take children to not just learn how to do something, to learn a sport, but we really do lack the basic structure to teach people core principles of values. How important have values been in your life in terms of shaping you, but how important has it also been in carrying through, maybe even to your kids to today?
Values to me, Nathan, has been really one of the most essential areas in my life. I recently had somebody reach out to me, and it was a humbling comment that I had someone share, and it was unexpected. And they reached out, and they'd known me since high school. And somebody reached out and said, I've been following you now for 30 some odd years in what you're doing. And here's one thing I just want to say. He says, you have been consistent in living out what matters to you. And he said, you've always been the same. And I've always knew that if you said you were going to do something, you did it. Now, that meant a lot to me in and of itself. But values are who we are, even when nobody else is looking. And if we don't have values, how do we value ourselves? How do we value other people? And how do we treat other people the way we would want to be treated? Going back to the golden rule. We've got to value people and see the value in them, but it starts with seeing the value in us. But having core morals and values that guide who we are, what we do, and the decisions that we make. You know, I find it interesting that people today are complaining about this recent law passed in Louisiana about being able to put the 10 Commandments back in school. And I'm like, well, why wouldn't we want to teach our kids not to steal, not to kill, not to, cheat on your wife or your husband, and some of these basic things that just make society civil. Mm-hmm. And that's what morals and values do. It creates a civil society where we can all live in harmony and peace with each other. Mm-hmm. But so much of what we see in society today, not only here in the United States, but in most of the Western world, is a destruction of values and morals. And with that, you begin to see the civility of society begin to crumble. And you go back in history, that was the fall of the Roman Empire. Yep. When they walked away from the morals and values that made them great, that civilization crumbled. Same thing happened with going back to the Grecian, looking at Greece in the ancient Grecian world. Same thing happened there. You go look at the Babylonian Empire. Same thing happened there. It's amazing that every great culture that's ever grown that had values and morals, and when those began to deteriorate and those began to fall, those great civilizations that ruled for eons crumbled and are no more. So lesson after lesson reminds us of the importance of these values and these morals in this culture. But when we walk away from it and we think that doesn't matter, it does, because for a civil society to exist, there has to be values and morals, and we all have to love each other, adhere to each other, maybe not agree, but agree to disagree rather than be willing to fight and destroy each other.
Man, what you're saying is just so spot on to kind of where we are as a world, not even just as a nation here in the United States, but really as a world, where we need to come back to really living out what our values are. It's so funny because you say consistency, and I hear you say consistency. I'm like, yeah, consistency. But most people, when you say consistency, they're like, is there another way? Could we get to the top of the mountain another way? Is there an elevator that gets up here?
No, there's not. No.
There's not. Yeah. No. But truly, like, as you're going up the mountain of life, of success, of significance, it truly is those hard moments in life that challenge who we are. And I've said this before on the program that I think life is really the crucible. It heats up, and you get to choose what it is that you're going to take out of it. What are you going to learn from those moments that life is really rough and really tough? What have been some of those really impactful moments in your life where life just really heated up? And maybe it was difficult at the time, but the lesson was an easy lesson to learn. What were some of those lessons that you had to extract? And maybe in the moment you didn't extract it really well, but maybe later on in life you look back and you go, now I get the lesson. Now I get why I had to suffer or I had to struggle here so that I could be here to teach this and to help others.
When I went through the divorce, that was a very difficult struggle in my life, because you have to go in and look at yourself and say, what part did I play in the process? It would have been easy just to point the finger at the other person and say it was all her fault. And for any relationship to dissolve, there's issues on both sides, and you've got to address your issue with that. But going through that struggle of being a single dad, trying to provide for my kids, trying to do those things, that was a difficult time for me because I was trying to be strong for them, trying to figure out what was next for me. And it was, like I say often, it's in that uncomfortable place that we don't want to go where growth happens. And we've talked about that all through the podcast so far. But I had to go there and I had to stay there. And then I think about when I got into starting the martial arts studio, the instructor that had gotten into trouble with the law, when he found out we were opening a school, he showed up at our school and threatened to bring all his black belts and beat us up in front of our students. And, so we had to deal with this constant war of this other instructor wanting to shut our school down and saying, well, we can't teach. We're not black belts. And I'm going to get the state of Arkansas involved and get you shut. We went through all of this mess. But out of that, it was that consistency of saying, we're going to do what we're going to do regardless of the pressure around us, because consistency compounds. But with consistency, there's another thing you got to have, and that's persistency, because you can be consistent, but the moment you quit, consistency's ended. So when you're consistent, you've also got to be persistent in pushing through those challenges and obstacles that we all face in life. My first son was born 3 months premature. And I remember going through that issue of having a young boy that was 2 pounds, 4 ounces, 13 inches long in a little plastic bubble, surviving for his life. I'm working, trying to take care of my wife at the time that was having health issues from this eclampsia condition she'd been in. And she had memory issues and couldn't remember who she was, where she was. And so I'm dealing with an amnesiac wife that we've got this small child that we're trying to raise. He was in and out of the hospital multiple times. That was another one of those dark moments of just, driving to Little Rock, wondering when you get there, is your son going to make it? Is he going to get through this period? Because at that time, he was one of the smallest premature babies ever to survive. Very challenging moment for me. And I remember thinking, if I could do something to change places with him, I would do that. And that to me was stopping and looking at that going, I've never thought that way before. But it was because this little life was dependent on me. And I was willing to do anything and everything in my power to try to make his life better. But I had to come to the realization I couldn't. It was one of those things I had to give it to God and hope that he gives the wisdom and the knowledge to the doctors, and that my son has an opportunity to respond. And I can say today that he's 36 years old and doing fantastic at what he does. And you wouldn't know today, if you saw him on the street, that, he would fit in the crook of my arm when he was born. And, now he's just this amazing young man that works in the manufacturing industry with all this computerized electronic stuff and is doing things I don't have a clue how it works, but he just absolutely loves it.
Yeah, don't you just push the button and everything works? I love that you bring up faith, because faith is such a huge aspect of our life that when we lack in our faith, when we lack in our relationship with our Creator, we truly do struggle and suffer more, right? When you look at the Israelites and wandering through the desert, why were they there? Well, they didn't trust God. They were leaning on their own understanding. This is what we're going to do. And God said, okay, well, I'll let you do what you want to do. And there are times where God does that. Right. Your faith, it comes back to your dad, where just like even the stories of your dad driving every single Sunday 50 miles to take you guys to church for 7 years. Like that's crazy. Most people won't even get in their car and drive 30 minutes, 15 minutes to go to church, to be, butts in the seat. To hear your dad establishing that consistency over the years is quite remarkable to me. I'm curious about your faith, though. When did your faith become your own? And how did your faith continue to lead you and strengthen you through times of adversity?
Nathan, for me, I think my faith really became real somewhere between 12 and 14, when I came to an understanding of what the Bible actually meant and what it meant to me. And from that, it's really been a driving force of what I've done my entire life. I started early on in studying for the ministry, thinking I wanted to be like my dad. And for many years, I was a bivocational minister. Dad started out in children's ministry and evolved from that. And so when Dad was pastoring, I was doing sock puppets when sock puppets were really made out of socks, and not the fancy little things that we have today. But out of that, just the opportunity to understand that there was something bigger than me, and that I had an opportunity to serve a cause, that is the cause of Christ, that was bigger than me. That's been an important part of everything I've done. And to think about the fact that every single person that has ever been created is a unique creation, one of a kind, that has been put on this earth on purpose for a purpose, and that God loved them so much that he sent his only son to die for them. Had they been the only person that had ever committed a sin or an atrocity or violated God's commands, he would have done that for them. That was moving to me. And that was an understanding of the compassion and love and value that I need to have for other people. And so what I had to learn to do over time is when I see other people, I learn to see them as a unique creation of God. And, sometimes when it's people that you really don't like or you really don't want to be around, it's hard, but it's in that learning process of understanding that they may not be where they're supposed to be, but God created them on purpose for a purpose. And if I can have an opportunity to speak in their life to help them to discover that or realize that or come to an understanding of who he is and the incredible relationship they can have with him, that's something that drives me to do what I do every day.
My wife and I were having a conversation. We were walking the other day, and she was talking about being Christ-like, finding your identity in Christ. And it was an interesting conversation because, normally we'll go back and forth, we'll spat back and forth and kind of debate what it is. Her response was quite eye-opening to me. And I want to ask you the question because I think it's quite fascinating. You've been around the block a couple times. You've studied theology, which is pretty amazing too. So I feel like you kind of have your head on your shoulders there. But I'm curious, what does it mean to have your identity in Christ? Because we kind of throw it around as Christians. We're like, oh yeah, my identity is in Christ. And if you were to ask that person, what does that actually mean? I think most people go, right? Because identity is a huge piece, especially for someone who believes in Jesus Christ. Like there's something to be said about this. What does it mean to have your identity in Christ?
Yeah. To me, it's understand because an identity is who you are. And when we talk about, your identity being in Christ, it's understanding the uniqueness of what Christ has put inside of you. And when you understand the uniqueness of what he's equipped you with and what he's prepared you with and what he's called you to do, when you begin to live that out and you begin to experience that and the people around you begin to experience that, that to me is identifying with Christ. Being willing to sacrifice what you want to do for the benefit of other people. That's living the Christ life. Being willing to have compassion for people and give people the opportunity to give forgiveness for things they've done to offend you. And as a result of, them doing something that you think could be unforgivable, that again is identifying with Christ. So to me, it's our identity of who we are and how we live our lives and allowing the love and the life and all the incredible examples of servant leadership that we read in the Gospels and allowing that to manifest through our lives in our own unique way so that we become, as I like to describe it, a walking, talking, living, breathing Bible, that if the way we live our lives has people come and say, well, Nathan, what is it about you that's different? John, what is it about you that's different? Then we get the opportunity to communicate with them and share with them, here's what makes me different.
Wow. I love that answer. Yeah, it was funny because when Willow was answering me, I was, my wife is very smart, but there's sometimes that she just says something that stops me in my track. And in that moment, she looked at me and she said, I think finding your identity in Christ is when we stop trying to please everything else in the world and we just do things to please God.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And it was so profound. I was like, that's amazing. Like, I wish I could have said an answer like that because it's like, right. We find our identity in accolades. We find our identity in stuff. We find our identity in other people, the spouse, our kids. And what we do is we seek approval from these people. We seek approval from these things of, am I doing it right? Is this okay? If you have your relationship with God, with Christ, if you have your identity there, it's not just seeking approval, you're seeking his love because no matter what you do, he's going to love you. Obviously you want
That's
to,
right.
Don't go kill people. That's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Going back to those 10 commandments.
Putting his agenda before your own, I think is a great way to say that.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much.
Yeah.
John, I have absolutely loved our time together. For those of you listening, I want to encourage you. I want you to go check out everything that he does. Everything is going to be in the show notes because he has 2 incredible books. He has content up the wazoo that will help you grow. If you're looking for someone that encourages you, that wants to make you better, go check out his content, and you're going to learn how to become a black belt leader, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Before we wrap up, though, John, I do want to ask you one more question. I think it's pretty fantastic that you have 6 amazing children. And I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here. I think it would be kind of fun to learn what your children have taught you over the years. Lessons that specifically speak to your heart. Maybe there's key characteristics. Like we see things in ourselves and our children. Sometimes it's the bad stuff. And you're like, maybe I need to talk a little kinder. Or maybe it's on the opposite side of things where you look at one of your kids and you go, you are incredibly kind-hearted and gentle. That is a trait that they get from you, or it's a trait that they get from their mother. I'm curious, what are 6 lessons, not 7. Yeah. Surprise, there's another child. What are 6 lessons that you could glean from one of each of your children over the course of the last few decades?
Yeah. So if I start with my oldest, Andrea, one of the things she has taught me is the importance of being patient in training. Andrea is a very beautiful girl, but she's one of those that is kind of independent, wants to do things her way. She wants the guidance and advice, but you've got to be patient in how you give it to her, give her time to process that so that it becomes her decision down the road. And so learning to be patient in the process of training has been something that she's taught me. My oldest son, Jonathan, has taught me the importance of being a fighter, because I watched him as a young boy fight for his very life. And from that, I've learned that if you're willing to fight the good fight and put forth the effort and continue to press forward, there's an opportunity to see success. And in his life, he has overcome some incredible things physically, mentally, and emotionally to see success in what he does. My middle son, Jordan, is kind of our brainiac. And from him, I've learned that when you begin to stretch your kids and introduce them to new things, you never know what they're going to gravitate to. I mean, who'd have thought that he was going to become this computer nerd that is now writing gaming software programs? And so out of that, it's don't try to put your child in a box and think, I want him to be this, because I had some specific things I thought I wanted him to do, and I wanted to groom him to that, but that wasn't who he was. And so I learned from him to identify and understand the uniqueness of each of our children, and that their gifts and their callings may not be the gifts and callings I think they should pursue, and give them the autonomy to be their own person and step into the greatness of who they are. From my middle daughter, Jessie, I've learned that sometimes when your kids follow you and they see what you do, they want to follow in your footsteps. And so Jessie, I've written 8 books. Jessie's written 29, and she's only 25 years old. So now the contest is, can I catch up with my daughter? But she is one of those that's developed this entrepreneurial spirit. And one of the things I've learned from her is there's always something more that you can do. I mean, this is something I've lived out my life, but her seeing all the things that she's doing and all the things she's touching in the life she's changing, it reminds me it's easy just to sit back and say, okay, I've done enough. I'm going to slow down. But no, I mean, if you're called to be driven, go drive. And, you can rest when you're dead. So let's just go drive. And from that, it's just kind of become this little competition that, I'm going to keep up with you. Can you keep up with me? And, Mark Cole calls us the dynamic daddy-daughter duo. So we fight over who's Batman and Robin. So with Joshua, my youngest son, one of the things I've learned from him is that sometimes your kids are smarter than you are. And it's important to learn the lessons they want to teach you about life that you may be overlooking because they see the world differently than you do. My youngest daughter, Kira, what I have learned from her is she is a giver of gifts, and that is who she is. And I've learned that sometimes words are valuable, but at other times it's the giving of a gift. It's a hug. It's, stopping at McDonald's and getting a sweet tea. It's, hey, let's go play some putt-putt and let's just go spend time together, learning to recognize the unique language of love that each of my children speak is different. And so that's a lesson I've learned from her that's been extremely valuable. And then from my wife, the last lesson, if you want a 7th one there, the lesson I've learned from my wife is in the areas that I'm weak, she's strong. And together we've been able to do more than I could ever have done on my own.
Drop the mic. Absolutely fantastic. John, I really do thank you so much for being on the show. It has been a pleasure to talk with you, to hear your story. I know that each one of you listening right now is full of great wisdom that he was able to pour out to us on this short amount of time. Make sure that you go like this episode, share it with a friend, and until next time, remember to be more, see more, and experience more than before.